Hello. Thank you for this opportunity to present my argument for why it's time for a ruminant revolution to combat malnutrition and metabolic illnesses in order to enable sustainable development globally. I believe we have an opportunity and indeed a responsibility to increase the public's awareness of grasslands and forages, of ruminant animal agricultural systems, and the opportunity to integrate ruminant animal livestock with our cropping systems, as well as a need to shift policies and support to reduce malnutrition and improve public health. I believe that by doing this, we can foster sustainable development, increase human flourishing, and preserve and enhance our environments. My purpose today is to introduce a number of topics. I'm always trying to encourage students, researchers, and advisors, regardless of what institutions they're associated with, as well as encouraging individuals to improve their own health. And I'll provide references and resources for further study. This argument is broad and must, by necessity, cover and touch upon a number of topics. Time is limiting today, and so we must focus on the givens that there are too many people in the world today who don't get enough animal source food in their diet, and that occurs in low, middle, and high income countries. That all food production has impacts that too often aren't accurately balanced when we talk about animal agriculture versus plant source food production. The grasslands and ruminant animal agriculture are in fact essential to public health, sustainable food systems, culture and tradition preservation, and sustainable development. Ruminants, in fact, have been essential in the development of modern humans. They're essential today in modern food systems globally, and they are essential in meeting the needs of 2050 and beyond. Livestock agriculture today is too often portrayed as the scapegoat in a number of problems, as opposed to the solution or part of the solution to many of these issues. But when we examine those arguments in detail, we find that they frequently are not factually based, but they tend to be more the result of worldview, belief system, or larger narratives. And the fact is, there can be no sustainable food systems without livestock in general, and without ruminant animal livestock in particular. There's a great deal of interest in North America, and I suspect elsewhere around the world, in soil health and regenerative agriculture. And I'm glad to see that growing awareness. I just want to point out that these are not new ideas, that these are issues that people have been aware of, researching, trying to address for virtually a century now. While it is appropriate to be concerned about deforestation and potential impacts on those ecosystems, it seems only right that we also realize that our grasslands are far more threatened globally than forests are, although there are regional differences. However, when people talk about increasing the consumption of commodity crops produced on arable lands, most of those arable lands are on what were once prairies or grasslands that have already been converted But too often the conversations are framed as if it's either livestock agriculture or plant agriculture. And in fact, the future, I believe, lies in development of integrated livestock cropping systems, systems where we can produce more food from the same amount of land with the same or lower inputs, and at the same time improving soil health, protecting that most precious resource. One key advantage of ruminants in these production systems is that they end up removing very little of the nutrients that they consume. And so, properly managed, those nutrients are available for succeeding crops. In this case, the nutrient removal rate are calculated from average yields in Missouri in central US. Again, when people advocate for increasing consumption of the plant source foods, it's not well appreciated that that's going to result in a higher removal rate and therefore the need to replace those from fertilizers of some form. Again, it's not a new idea that grassland farming is essential to systems of good soil management. What isn't well appreciated is that we can't feed today's world, let alone the world of 2050, without ruminant animal agriculture. And our challenge is to increase the productivity and efficiency of regionally and culturally appropriate ruminant animal agriculture systems around the world. Because of the unique ecological role of ruminants, whether domestic or wild, to utilize high fiber, low fat, low protein quality feed resources, these animals in our domesticated systems have a unique role in providing highest quality food from feeds that are not utilizable by human beings. And in conversations about replacing meat or milk from ruminants with processed plant products, it frequently isn't recognized that we're not producing food in those systems, we're processing foodstuffs that were already human utilizable into a human utilizable, some would say, food-like substance in the case of fake meat or fake milk. Just to emphasize that the vast majority of the feed that goes into supporting the domesticated ruminant livestock herd globally is not human edible. Approximately 96% is not human edible. Only 4% of the feed going into the global ruminant herd is grains. And about a quarter of those grains were not human edible in this study for one reason or another, off-grade spoilage, issues such as that. And this amount of grain actually only represents 10% of the global cereal production. For some reason, predictions of catastrophe and crises always draw attention. And over the years, there's been a number of these that in time have been shown to be not true, but we still are paying attention to some of the same people who make those arguments, again, with a new crisis. And these catastrophists are very active today, telling us why we need to be worried about this, that, or the other thing, and why we need to be investing resources in the cause that they're supporting. Unfortunately, they tend to ignore the fact of continuing malnutrition today. And that while we still have 800 million people in the world today suffering from a lack of calories in their diet, we have 2.2 billion people who are overweight or obese. This also is malnutrition, although it frequently isn't seen as such, in part because too few people understand that undernutrition is not synonymous with caloric deficit, that it's possible to be overfed yet undernourished. And in fact, it's protein energy malnutrition that is the most lethal form of malnutrition, impacting children to a great degree. In fact, globally, children under 5 years old, half are deficient in a number of micronutrients that are essential for proper development. These are best sourced from animal source food. Nearly a quarter of children under 5 globally are stunted. That is, they have a low height to weight. And this isn't merely stature, this is also cognitive or brain development, which lasts a lifetime. 7% of children globally under 5 are wasted, that is, they are low weight to height, and at the same time, 6% are overweight. Now, while many will advocate that humanity needs to adopt a plant-based diet, it should be pointed out that in fact humanity's diet is already plant-based. Globally, the vast majority of calories in humanity's diet comes from plant source foods, which means the majority of calories are coming from sugar and or starch. What isn't sufficiently appreciated is that we are in the midst of a global pandemic of non-communicable diseases, which account for the vast majority of deaths globally, and that these are, if not caused, they are exacerbated by insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, chronically elevated insulin. As I mentioned, this is global in scope. Too many people believe that these only exist in high-income countries, when in fact 80% live in low and middle-income countries. Over the next 8 years, there's a prediction we will see a 150% increase in type 2 diabetes alone. Too many people don't understand that obesity is a symptom, not in fact a cause of these conditions. Yet much of the conversation about sustainable food consumption operates as if that's not true, that in fact obesity drives diabetes instead of being a symptom of the metabolic derangement that also manifests itself as type 2 diabetes. Likewise, the vast majority of crude protein in humanity's food supply comes from plants already. In fact, more crude protein is provided in humanity's diet by cereals than from all animal source foods combined. And wheat alone is the single largest source of crude protein in humanity's diet. And if we were to understand human nutrition properly and the need for digestible, indispensable amino acids, not crude protein, we would appreciate that cereals are a very poor source of those indispensable digestible amino acids. There are specific goals that people involved in sustainable development are looking at in terms of reducing childhood stunting, wasting, and overweight. Unfortunately, this community of people are primarily informed by conventional nutrition wisdom, not wisdom informed by metabolic syndrome and metabolic health. In fact, they're still operating under crude protein as protein in humanity's food supply instead of indispensable amino acid and potential deficiencies. Another cause for concern is the price of inputs. And in this case, I'm just going to look at fertilizer. This graph showed the trend for September 2020 through September 21 in the United States for diammonium phosphate, potash, and urea, which I then updated with current prices in the United States, reflecting record high prices for diammonium phosphate and urea, as well as dramatic increase in potash. This dramatic increase in input costs is not only due to conflict in Ukraine, but that conflict is likely to ensure that these prices remain elevated for a significant period of time. Meanwhile, we face these challenges of increasing world population, which will require a doubling of world food production, a significant increase in the demand for animal protein, while we try to achieve that from the same land area today, and yet conflicts such as the Ukraine-Russia situation are effectively taking out significant sources of food production. And whatever systems and wherever we're going to be producing food, we're faced with the need to limit, if not reverse, the loss of arable topsoil. By 2050, it's projected that the 70% of humanity will live in urban areas. So this transfer of nutrients and foods from areas of production to areas of consumption will get worse. And for example, other development must occur in order to support development economically, socially, one being a doubling of electrical generating capacity. And despite what some will say, the animal source foods are essential if the low and middle income countries are going to be able to feed their way out of poverty. One of the most significant impediments to the adoption of a ruminant revolution mindset is the change in human nutrition from a perspective of achieving adequate essential nutrition to the nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease perspective. From this come all the recommendations that we need to reduce animal source food production and consumption. In the face of this, we need to point out that at least 80% of the recommendations that stem from this kind of research fail when they're finally examined in clinical trials. So this branch of human nutrition has been a negative impact on food policy and therefore investment in research and extension and global programs. Because of this influence from nutritional epidemiology, most of the world's doctors and human nutritionists are misinformed, as reflected by a survey conducted by Credit Suisse. We need to find ways to work with researchers and clinicians who are demonstrating that none of these 5 bullet points are in fact true when the majority of doctors believe them to be so. And it's because of these false beliefs that too many still advocate for reduction in animal source food consumption. When one examines the highest quality scientific evidence now available, one can conclude that humanity's existential crisis is in fact insufficient animal source food. Our opportunity and in fact responsibility as researchers in agronomy and animal science is to find ways to improve the productivity and efficiency of ruminant animal agriculture while working with those members of medicine and human nutrition who are demonstrating that animal source food is in fact essential for human development and function. So while we had a green revolution in the 60s and 70s that was necessary to provide sufficient calories to avoid famine, it's now necessary for us to have a ruminant revolution to provide more higher quality food to support proper human development and function. Our mission is to improve the productivity and efficiency of our global grassland agricultural systems to sustainably provide the higher quality diet that humanity requires, while preserving and enhancing our remaining grassland ecosystems. Of course, this is going to require public and private support. And so one of my efforts has been to build bridges between various scientific disciplines and introduce people from my metabolic health tribes to people from my animal science and agronomy tribes. Because at the end of the day, consumers and producers care about the same things. We just may understand them differently because of our different perspectives. And if we could foster better communication, then I think we could generate the support necessary to make the progress that we're going to have to make to meet these goals of the near future. And answer those who, for whatever reason, believe that the production and consumption of animal source foods is incompatible with sustainable development, when in fact they're essential. Ecosystems and the food systems they support are incredibly complex systems, and they may in fact be more complex than we're capable of thinking. But surely we must begin our examination of sustainable food systems with acknowledging the fact that animal source foods are more valuable nutritionally than plant source foods in the human diet. And yet too often they're treated as if they're equivalent. And so we can find people looking at caloric yield per hectare. And in the face of a pandemic of metabolic illness, perhaps growing sugarcane, which can yield a lot of calories per acre, is not appropriate. I've spoken elsewhere about the difference between crude protein and digestible indispensable amino acids. But briefly, some look at the crude protein supply across countries and come to the conclusion that protein supply is not a nutrient of concern. To demonstrate this problem, this paper calculated the crude protein supply for 103 low and middle income countries and territories, and looked at that compared to some protein requirement that was calculated based on RDA, recommended daily allowance. And this data demonstrates again that the vast majority of protein for these people is coming from plant source foods as opposed to animal source foods. But again, this is crude protein, in no way corrected for protein quality. And frequently others looking at these data would say, well, there's only a relatively small portion of these poorest of countries and territories where the protein supply does not meet this requirement. Well, there's two problems. One is that the protein requirement is undoubtedly too low, and that these data are not corrected for protein quality. And when these authors went through a number of steps to get to protein utilizability, it turns out that none of these 100 and some odd low and middle income countries and territories are achieving this arguably low target. And so by appropriately understanding protein nutrition in humans, we can completely change the picture from not being a nutrient of concern, as some would state, to obviously it's a nutrient of concern. And to supply that, we must increase the supply and affordability of animal source foods. And a significant amount of that is going to come from ruminant animal systems. In fact, when we apply this more appropriate understanding, it completely shifts the environmental footprint calculations of producing animal source protein and plant source protein. And we need to remember that we're not only getting these indispensable amino acids from animal source foods, we're getting a number of these shortfall nutrients as well. And when we look at the environmental footprint of trying to achieve those, again, animal source foods become even more attractive from merely looking at the greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to understand, in addition, that we've been using the wrong metrics when expressing the global warming potentials of these greenhouse gas emissions from ruminant animal systems as opposed to other food production systems. So now we're getting to the point where animal source food production from ruminants has a much, much lower greenhouse global warming potential impact than many have been saying for the past several years. And above all, we need to understand and internalize that it is possible to be fed but not nourished. And in fact, animal source foods are, I would say, essential in nourishing people. And therefore, we need to weigh that in our calculations and conversations about environmental impact. A key part of bridge building, I believe, is finding points of common interest. And given the rates of metabolic illness globally and malnutrition globally, I believe that this is a critical part of bridge building. One recent study estimated that almost 90% of adult Americans do not have optimal metabolic health. And even amongst those normal weight adult Americans, the prevalence of metabolic health is low. The majority of people who suffer from poor metabolic health are not aware of the nature of their condition. And in this study, they stated that if you have abdominal obesity or elevated serum triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, elevated blood pressure, or elevated fasting blood glucose, or if you were taking medications for any one of those conditions, you do not have optimal metabolic health. And the good news that I've learned from a number of metabolic health practitioners and researchers is that all of these can be treated by a therapeutic carbohydrate reduction lifestyle intervention. And in fact, drug-free remission from type 2 diabetes, for example, has now been demonstrated and is in the literature. But people won't make choices if they're not aware of the information. And so we need to find ways to interact with the metabolic health practitioners, and by doing so, we can help them understand what we're doing to improve human flourishing as we research improved forage, livestock, cropping systems. And that when we help people improve their own health by getting them the information they need or introducing them to the practitioners to help them on their journey, we are in fact improving the world. That ruminant animal livestock are part of the solution, that humanity requires a higher quality diet. Livestock are essential to food systems, that we currently are experiencing an epidemic of metabolic, that is, non-communicable diseases, which are the largest cause of death globally. That there is a dietary intervention to lower this global burden that focuses on reducing processed carbohydrates and ensuring adequate animal source food. So given the observations, a significant number of people we know are likely to have insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia and related conditions. They could benefit from this therapeutic carbohydrate reduction intervention. And people who have experienced this health improvement journey often become our advocates as we strive to find more support for what we're already engaged in and the work that we need to do to meet the goals of 2050. We need to recognize and challenge the human nutrition community, because there's been a failure to acknowledge the weak scientific basis of their dietary guidelines, because their dietary guidance frequently impacts policy and research investment that we need to make the improvements. There's been a failure to incorporate the highest quality scientific evidence available in their guidelines and policies, and they have failed to address a global epidemic of malnutrition. So I challenge my colleagues in range management, grassland, and ruminant animal agriculture to stop accepting the pronouncements from the global nutrition community, to stop citing them in our research, and to challenge their legitimacy wherever possible and appropriate. Some resources I'd offer people to learn more: the October 2019 issue of Animal Frontiers was titled Foods of Animal Origin, a Prescription for Global Health. The Clear Center at UC Davis contains a great deal of information on the environmental issues related to animal agriculture. Animal source foods in ethical, sustainable, and healthy diets is available online, a dynamic white paper. The Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners is a global community that offers accreditation to clinicians and physicians. They have a practitioner locator, but they also offer a clinical guidelines document for therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, which contains a good literature review. I'd also point out that 2026 has been declared the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists, and you can find information at this website. In addition, there's a number of books that I frequently recommend or have found interesting, and if you scan this QR code, you should be taken to a book list that I've started and maintain on the US Amazon website. I receive no financial reward for Amazon purchases, and in fact, you would probably need to take the titles and purchase them from the Brazilian Amazon site. Again, call to action: improve your own health, help others on that journey, promote grassland's essential role in alleviating malnutrition, insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, as well as integrated livestock cropping systems. I call attention to the 25th International Grasslands Congress, May of 2023 in Kentucky. The title is Grasslands for Soil, Animal, and Human Health. The call for papers is now open. The deadline is July 15th, I believe, 2023. of this year. So, and again, the 2026 International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. Thank you for your attention. I am available on social media. I appreciate the support. If you want to get in contact with me, you can email me at peter.ballerstedt@gmail.com, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have. Thank you again.